I'm going to begin this session, first of all, in the share screen, showing you my handout on my particular handout on this particular thing on the census, and showing you how invaluable that a census can be within a timeline. I do most all of my work. I mean, I have a database that I keep my materials in, but when I'm really looking to do research, I truly depend on my timelines, because in my timelines, I've put everything in that I've found so far about a total family. And I also then put in the things that, I call it my shopping list. When I first start with a new family, one of the first things I'll put in is I will look at the time span that I think that they're in, and I will begin putting together my shopping list of censuses, both U.S. censuses and, for the states that have them, the state censuses, so that I know I have to go shop and find those things and get them in, because I know they're going to be the handy dandy thing for me. They're really going to help. So when we look at this one today, this is my Coglizer family. And one of the things I wanted to show you is that there's a variety of names here, just all in the first page. These are all Coglizers, Colghlazer, Clazer, Calcglazer, Calck, and they're all in the same time period, and they are all in Pennsylvania at this point. And really, they just got over the biggest name change, and that was having their name start with a K. So I always keep track also of all the possible names, because as I've come on, then I theorized that they had to be related, and then I discovered that they were. But I'm just showing you a couple of brief things here that show them from 1830. And I really could show them from earlier, but this is a nice succinct account. 1830 in Luzerne County, and they're staying there. And by 1850, you can see down here that every name is there. So now I know for sure who these people are. I can put in questions like, where were Daniel and Pauline and family? And I still don't have the answer to that one as of this. All I can theorize at this point is, because I haven't found them, they must have died. But moving right through, you can continue to see them. And then you can begin to see when these families migrate. They move after the Civil War, and finding them is just quite handy. Now, in between each and every one of these censuses, because I've compressed this data for you, in between each and every one of these are all the other things in my regular timeline. They are all the things that I have that I was able to find within county histories and county records, like poll taxes and road taxes and things that we've discussed before. So this is just a really short thing. I'm showing you just a little over 3 pages, but when you look at my data in my real sheet, I believe it's way over 10 pages worth of data early on for these people. This is the power of what a timeline can do for you. I scribble all over my timelines. I guess I call them dirty timelines because of that, because I've got questions in there. And if I found the answer to something that I asked a question, then I'll line it out just like I would with this. If I had the answer to where were Daniel, Pauline, and family, I would line it out just with a little handy dandy thing that we've got that we can work for that. So that's what that looks like. Hopefully, in looking at timelines, you might consider this because I just find it to be one of the greatest tools ever that we could have. I'm going to stop the share on the Coglizer timeline now, and I'm going to actually go over to my presentation. Let's see, let's get that shared. And let's go right to the beginning, and from the beginning, using censuses in your essential timelines, because I'm going to tell you, I really do think timelines are essential if you really want to get ahead with your research. It's a case of pay me now or pay me later, because you're going to wish that you had these things as you go along. So timelines and censuses are two examples of things that you ought to have in a thing I call a genealogy toolbox. Now, there's lots of things that I'll talk about, and I've talked about before, that are in the toolbox. Today, we're going to concentrate on the timeline, but just the censuses that you can put into it that will help you, because they're going to help you with the patterns of your ancestors moving through time and place. They're going to help you to find data to determine the patterns, and they perform as a time and place or geographical set of tools in recording your ancestors. They're going to tell you, and I need to go back, pardon me, they're going to tell you place, that is the country, the state, the county, the city, town, rural area, sometimes the length of residence for people. Things that the Congress, who formulated our census questions each and every time, as part of their duties, as shown in the Constitution. So they were interested in the number of immigrants because they needed to know who was coming in and where they were coming. Citizen status, especially after the Civil War. Who were veterans? What were the occupations? What kinds of social status should they be collecting in the census that would help them? I remind you again that censuses were never a full-time agency of the United States government until the 20th century. Before that, they were usually part-time or for a very short amount of time, and then with definitely a skeletal number of people working in between those decades. I sincerely believe that you are geography and geography is you. This doesn't come from me. It comes from the American Association of Geographers. I think they say it well when they say, when you go to a place, you affect the place, and that place affects you. We knew early on, as a result of other kinds of censuses already done in our American colonies, how essential and how much needed the decennial censuses were. And we've been holding our decennial censuses since 1790 up through 2020. I remind you again that the only census available right now, the last one is 1950. There's a 72-year lag in the information unless you've got some compelling reason to get after your senator or your representative to see if they can help you get census information you need, say, for citizenship or for some other reason in your family. You can get them, but it's a very, very difficult process. Otherwise, as citizens, we still gain from the aggregated information collected even in the 2020 census that we just took, because the overall data from that set of aggregated information is already out there. You can go, for example, in Montana to the Montana state government economic and business site and see things that are collected. And in fact, there's lots of information having to do with that that's collected every day. So we have decennial censuses, but please remember, we also collect data every single day that is helpful to show us what we need to be looking at for the future. But how can the census info be helpful to you? I'll have people say, geez, I wish they would have asked such and such. And I'll say, yeah, but we have to remember they asked what Congress decided they needed for information. So it's going to provide data about families and about communities, regions, states, and territories at timed intervals. And sometimes it's even to go backward and collect a question that's been done once before just to see if it's still true in the present, maybe 40 years later. You'll see this in the 1940 census that I'll talk about later. It records those who were at a particular place and their certain circumstances of their lives. Like for 1940, you get the education level. Many times you get the occupation. You get the marital status, housing, citizenship, for example. And they also collected information useful to grow national knowledge about factors such as health, like the mortality schedules of 1850 through 1880. A mortality schedule, by the way, for those years came from data that counties at the county level were asked to provide. They were asked to begin looking for all of those who died in their county 12 months prior to the 1850 census, 1860, 1870, and 1880 at that county level, plus what they knew about the cause of death. And those mortality schedules overall are available. It's just, of course, that Montana doesn't really get in on it because if there would have been one for 1890, we might have. But remember, we were just becoming a state at that point. The good news is that the information from these mortality schedules is still available to you. When you can't find a person and they died the year before, you think that they died a year or two before a decennial census, I would be looking at that decennial mortality schedule for those years 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880. They're quite helpful. This is just one such example of a way in which we've grown our national knowledge and begun our agencies in response to the health needs of our people, for example. There are others. The censuses at a 10-year interval give us a glimpse of ancestors, and most importantly, although what I see people say, I found my people. That's great. But take a look at their community. Look at the people and the neighbors right around them. Remember, the censuses are not aggregated back again by alphabet, so you have a great opportunity to look at the people who lived next door. They are timely. They provide great context if you're willing to look at that neighborhood, because that's where the social statistics at the county level come from. So I looked at my great-great-great-grandfather, Zurich Cogleiser. I showed you a timeline for him earlier, living in Cass County, Nebraska in 1880. He had come from Ohio after 1870, and before that, he was born in Pennsylvania. But in 1880, I found him as a man in his 60s. He was a Union veteran. He was disabled. He was no longer farming. And two of his neighbors were in very similar circumstances in that they were Union vets too, and they were disabled. So it gave me kind of a picture of who might have been out there. And as it turns out, many, many Union soldiers took the opportunity to go out to Nebraska and homestead, because Nebraska gave them the opportunity not to have to fulfill 5 years on their homestead. If they had been honorably discharged, then every year that they spent in the Army counted for 1 year of homestead presence. And that meant that for my great-great-grandfather, he only had to be on that land for a year. And by then he'd built a few things and he sold it. And he was in Johnson County at that point, and he went next door to Cass County and lived, because that's where his brother was. I'm going to recommend some resources to you that I think are very, very important. One is the census book, Facts, Schedules, and Worksheets for the U.S. Federal Census by Bill Dollarhide. This is a tan-colored book printed in 2019 and is simply the best overall book that there is on the market right now, I believe, in terms of everything that you want to know about the U.S. Census. I wish someone else would do that same book for Canada and for England, because it would be a bestseller guaranteed. Bill is also the author of the Map Guide to the U.S. Federal Censuses, 1790 to 1920. I consider that one essential if I'm starting a study of people in a new state with which I'm not familiar. Why? Because he shows you how each state changes from the time of territory until the time that they are, until 1920, in fact. And so he will show you those and show you the changes in counties that can be helpful to you as you're trying to figure out, where do I get the information on these people at the county level? Another good one, published twice, first as a teensy book in 2010, and then again in 2018, is the Family Tree Fact Book. key genealogy tips and stats for the busy researcher. It goes way beyond the census. And because it does, it can't quite give the detail that Bill Dollarhide does, but it's a very good book. And then Bill has two other books, The American Migration Routes, Indian Paths, Post Roads, Wagons, Volume 1, and his Volume 2 on stagecoaches and railroads and so on, published. And they are well worth it because he shows you the American migration routes in relationship to today's maps. And that is invaluable. Which one would I get? Well, don't ask me because I would get all of them. I do have all of them because I think they are important. They are in our library if you happen to make it here. But if you were talking to your spousal unit or your kids about something you might like for Christmas, I'd sure talk to them about at least one of these. They're very, very good, and you'll use them all the time, especially right now in the winter when we've just come up on all this snow. I use the decennial census information wisely. I use what's called a lifespan strategy. It's very simple. We all use it. I take a look at a target person and look at their lifespan if I am able to figure it out. And I use that as a means to determine the census is needed. So Zura's lifespan was 1827 through 1904. I knew immediately that I wanted everything back behind 1827 that I could get, 1800, 1810, 1820, in the effort to find his family. And of course, I would need everything through 1900, but then by then, his kids were there with their lifespans, so I continued onward. The lifespan then, plus the place of birth, defined the first U.S. census you need. So for me, it was a Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, June 1, 1830 census. From there, I could go backward, I could go forward, and I had the means to begin to identify the family. Of course, I had a problem with that 1830 census because it only named an actual name. It only named the person who was the head of household. And then you get into all those little interesting tick marks that show people and their ages. But at least for 1850, I could immediately go back to 1840 and identify every one of those people then in 1830. So I was very comfortable with that. It's essential for each person's lifespan, as it has helped me to confirm the familial relationships, to find the kids, for example, or the people who died in between, or maybe they were born, but they were not alive in the next census. So you could begin to look for that other information that told you whether they died, whatever had happened to them. These are then, they are reliable pieces of data that you can count on. Will you find mistakes sometimes? Will you find people who fibbed on their censuses? Yes. And I make sure I put every bit of that in. I make sure that if I found somebody who fibbed, I go back and annotate that census in my timeline so that I have it and so that my niece-fews and all of my relatives have it in that thumb drive that I give them each Christmas about those. I keep hoping that somebody else will really want to enter the arena. And I think I found one this last weekend, by the way. So when we look at Luzerne County, Pennsylvania on June 1, 1830, the census revealed that there were 3 quotation marks Cogleiser families. They had names alike. And I determined that Daniel Cogleiser over in Hanover Township was of a collateral line, and he's the one that disappeared, but I have him down. He's there. The family just disappeared by 1840. In Providence Township was my family I wanted. As you can see, there was one male under the age of 5. Well, that I knew it was Zura because of his age, because he was born in 1824, whatever. And so there he was. I could look and I could make conjectures about each and every family member, not counting the male between 15 and 20, maybe a cousin or something, but I will never know. I could also look and see that another collateral line, Eleanor or Ellen's family was there, and she disappears, I figure, into a marriage, and the marriages I have not found for that family yet. But I keep track of all of the families that I can identify in an area. I keep track of them together because I want to know when they move. I want to know what I should be looking for in the county records, who I should be looking for, not just scanning for that one person, Zura, but scanning for all these people. And in this one, I also pick up the Bessiker or Besecker, as they called it then, family, because Samuel Cogleiser, my 3 times great grand, his wife was Anna Besecker or Bessiker. So it gave me basic information, the geographic place of my direct line and possible ancillary families. It became my anchor place, and it can become your anchor place too if you are willing to look carefully at those lifespans and be generous with them. Extend them a little backward and a little forward so you're capturing the people you want. It gave me the township names, the county, and the state. That was absolutely invaluable in going back to look for what information might be out there or books that had been published. It gave me head of household names, the number of people in the household, the ranges of ages. It let me look at neighbors and their circumstances, and many of them appeared similar. They were all pretty poor people. So I could begin looking for official records then in those counties and begin to get things that I knew would be well related to the area that for which information I was seeking. And that would include, even a will, an inventory, an exchange of land, or the payment for land. It could include directories, just all kinds of things. It also allowed me, and it allows me when I look at this, to know when people left the area. Today, we have a fantastic resource right out at our census.gov, and I would have you look at it because it provides you the opportunity to track movement of family and that fan club. Remember, their friends and their acquaintances and ancestors and neighbors with whom they might have moved. In fact, many of them did. The 1850 to the 1950 census provides the head of household, the name of every person usually living there, the age, sex, the color, information unique to the particular census. And with that, I'm going to tell you, I'm not even getting into the slave schedules with this because they are a whole different presentation, and they're worth people going into if they know their family was poor, because we get into some kinds of records connected to those different censuses, which will tell you where to go to find poor people. It provides the relationship of every person in the household to the head of household. Maybe you'll see new children. Maybe you'll discover that your great-great-grand has a new wife. You might discover boarders who are living in the home, cousins, their moms, their dads, their in-laws, just a whole host of things. And most importantly, if people disappear the way Zura did after 1850, it tells me he migrated, because I couldn't find any. I knew that he was living in 1904. I just didn't know where he'd gone. I assumed and said, it can't be. There was no Nebraska at that point. So he can't have gone right there, at least not unless he was out there in territory. So I'm going to tell you about the censuses by information you can get. So for place and year of birth, 1790 through 1840, you can get the age ranges for free white men and free white women. Even free colored people, it doesn't give quite the same information, but there were records available for free colored people at that point. Age and birthplace, you can pretty well find from the 1850 census forward. It will be asked in slightly different ways, but you will be able to find out what state they were born in, what their approximate age is. It might be according to the present census, it might be according to the previous year. Those are both there, but there are questions that give you age and birthplace. For parents' place of birth, they begin asking about whether or not it is foreign born in 1870, and sometimes you can find that through many of the censuses. You just have to look carefully at the questions as they are asked. For all parents' place of birth, it begins in 1880. And those three columns that are there, the place of birth for the person you're looking at, the place of birth for his or her dad, and the place of birth for his or her mom, that's really invaluable in terms of helping you with that migration or non-migration. Children who were born in a particular census year at times then were recorded right down to the month. That didn't happen often, but it did. So you can begin to see that in 1900, we do just one time what other countrywide censuses commonly do, at least those that are in the British Isles, including New Zealand and Australia. They have always asked for the actual date of birth and place. Only in 1900 did our censuses ask for that. And do I occasionally find some of my family kind of shading at least their month of birth? Yes, I do. But it's a good indicator anyway, and a place for us to get started. If you're looking for marital status, there's whole bunches of information in our census. I'd love to say that 1890 census is available to us, but it's not. I recorded here because it was asked. It was the last time that this question of married within that particular year, like married within 1850, 1860, or whatever, that it was ever asked. But there's 5 censuses where a question related to that was asked. Marital status has been asked from 1880 through 1950. And beginning in 1880, of course, it led to us being able to tell whether or not the person listed right below the head of household really was his wife or her husband. People were asked the number of years they'd been married in 1900 and 1910. And take a look at those questions in 1930 and 1940 for the age at first marriage, because it could tell you, if you look closely at the two people, that they might have been married more than once. In 1940, they asked a single question of just some participants. 2 people on each page in 1940 were asked to give extra information. This was a question that was there just in case it was a lady and she had been married more than once. All others did not have to answer that. They also asked if they were female and ever married, how many children they had born, not counting stillbirths. That one still amazes me, but they were evidently trying to get a handle on that, and they knew that so many births ended in stillbirths, and they just weren't talked about. Citizenship and immigration. So we needed immigration information because we needed to know who was coming in. It was really quite open, except for Chinese and some other places in the Southern Hemisphere, but it was quite open. And so they were asking, are you an alien that has not been naturalized yet? They did that in 1820, 1830, and 1840. Now, that behooves you to get a lot of information about what that naturalization process included and who got naturalized automatically because their father got naturalized or their husband got naturalized. Their naturalization status began being asked in 1870 for males and 1890 forward for everybody. And there are some very interesting things because in 1940, when we suspected we were going to war, that particular census immediately had a different kind of paperwork that was enacted at the beginning of 1940 before the actual census, and that was an alien Registration Act. If you had never gone forward with your naturalization, you had to go to the post office and fill out a questionnaire and register as an alien. No, we don't naturally have that information available to us right now. Scoping it out, for example, our Great Falls information is probably down at the Denver Auxiliary NARA, the National Archives there. But I've written for it at least once and got no response, so I don't know what to tell you. It sure would be neat to be able to have that information. Years of immigration to the United States, they were asked in 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930. And by 1926, for sure, everybody had to seek their naturalization separately. It was no longer just given to an entire family. Number of years residing in the United States began to be asked in 1890 and 1900. Interestingly enough, if you want to find the answer to this question in many states, you can look for that same information on someone's death certificate, because it is asked in a much more local kind of context, saying, how many years have you been in the state? How many years in this town or county? And you'll get some pretty neat information there. And where did these questions come from that went to the death certificate? Well, they came from just this kind of information out of the U.S. Census, because we were aware that we needed that information. People were asked, especially Southerners, for their eligibility to vote in 1870. If they had not taken a new oath to the United States, then they could not vote in 1870, and many of them never did after that. But most people took that oath of citizenship again. With regard to health, there's a variety of things you may not be aware of. There are some special kinds of censuses that are done, and sometimes they're blended in at the same time as the other census. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a little while. But persons blind, deaf, or dumb were asked from 1830 through 1890, and once again in 1910, because they wanted to know if in 1910 that person was now in some kind of institution or being taken care of. States were attempting to respond to the needs of these people who were disabled. They also asked whether people were paupers or whether they were convicts. They asked who of those in the immediate household were idiotic or insane from 1850 through 1880 censuses. And for moms, they asked how many children and a number living in 1890, in 1900, and in 1910. They also asked whether people were suffering from a chronic disease and asked them to specify it in 1880. And we have overall information for some of the states for 1890, not by citizen, only overall information, because the Census Bureau had completed its report on chronic disease by the time that 1890 census burned much later. Number of children ever born was asked in 1940. Again, giving us some information. In 1940, there were quite a few questions asked about women's health, and that was because they were aiming to begin to do some studies funded by the federal government on women's health. They were aware of the fact that they had little information. That got put off by World War II, and some of those questions were asked again in slightly different format in 1950. So look for those. You can find answers to personal property and income in these decade censuses. If you're looking for the value of the real estate owned, look carefully. in these censuses. Don't just say to yourself, well, I know they didn't own land, so I'm not even going to look, because you'll get the value of the personal estate for a person. You know, they may not have land, but they have other things. In 1860 and 1870, those were terrific years when our nation was truly turbulent, first with the Civil War and then the after effects of the Civil War and the migrations that occurred as a result of that war. So whether they owned or rented homes were available here. And of course, we asked them in 1920, 1930, and in 1940, because we'd been going through a depression. And one of the things, there had not been a lot of homes built. So they were looking at the housing situation and trying to figure out what to do about it. People were asked for their income in 1940. Beginning in 1940 and going to 50 and to 60, there are sample questions. In 1940, in 1950, pardon me, there were 6 people per sheet, and they were asked 6 questions about income. Again, not everybody, but that was there. In 1863, just for your own knowledge, this was in between censuses, but the U.S. government had to find a way to fund the Civil War. So in 1863, they enacted a temporary income tax, and you will find those records for most of the states that were there at that time. So it's worth you looking for that information. Again, it's just ancillary. They had a habit of asking in the decades. They needed to fulfill something, so they did it in 1863. If you want to know about education, they asked about that. Attended school in the past year, 1840 through 1950, with the question being slightly changed in 1950. In 1940, it'll tell you the grade last attended or completed. And then in 1940, going beyond that grade completed, there was a sample question for 6 people on each sheet in 1950 and said, okay, did he or she finish this grade? And beginning in 1850, there was a can read and can write in English from most censuses going forward from there. Military service. You're going to be able to find the Revolutionary Military Service pensioners' name and age in the 1840 census, if they're still alive. If they're not, then I advise that you look for some pretty neat pension records that are available to you from NARA, the National Archives. They also ask about male citizens not eligible to vote in 1870s. In 1870, that was those Southerners not taking an oath of allegiance. The veteran schedule for the Civil War was there in 1890. And hallelujah, this is the one thing that was saved from the fire. So you can find the veteran schedule just for the Union soldiers in 1890. It will also tell you who else is collecting that pension if that Civil War veteran is dead. And for later wars, beginning World War II, they asked and said, if this child is the child of a veteran, is that veteran father dead? One time. They were beginning to be aware of their responsibilities. So those special census schedules are things like the industry and manufacturing schedules. They began in 1810. That was the 3rd U.S. Census, and they began asking about manufacturing because they were interested in the businesses right down to county level. What was being put together? What was there in the county? What did they have? So you'll find them asking that through at least 6 or 7 censuses. The agriculture schedules were something that were asked for a long time. If you're wondering why they weren't asked before 1850, it's because it was assumed that about 90 to 95% of all families were involved in some kind of agriculture. Beginning 1850, they asked a separate agricultural schedule question. Those are interesting for the places that have been saved. That Dollarhide book, the census book, will tell you every single state. Ancestry will it's not thorough at Ancestry, but it will tell you every single state schedule that is still available because some of them were not turned in or they were not kept. Interestingly, they began to ask the same thing about ag schedules with the territories of the United States in 1929 and 1930. They needed to know what was going on in Hawaii, what was going on in Alaska, what was going on in Puerto Rico, and so on. The mortality schedules were asked for at least those 4 years, and they were not asked again because by then states were beginning to collect their own information, beginning to make births, deaths, and marriage schedules, and the actual state records for them by that, just depending on when they started. And so they began to be collected at the state level, and then those things were swept in automatically at state level to the federal government. The slave schedules I mentioned earlier for 1850 and 1860 will give you some idea of your families there. Tough, really, really hard, because mostly if you saw them, it might be just the number of slaves held. Very occasionally there might be first names, but don't count on it. But you can and you should, not only for slaves, those colored people who were held as slaves, you also need to see and begin to work with the Freedmen's Bureau information beginning 1870 and later, because they identified many of those people, gave them helps of various kinds. And by the way, they also helped other poor people. So you might find your family in there. The county data became important from 1850 to 1870. All kinds of things about the county, what the county had, what it didn't have, and so on. Various social statistics. And of course, it's carried forward in every census to this day, but it's usually today carried forward month by month. These are social statistic questions that are asked either in postcard information sent to your home, or they might be a question on a telephone survey for you or some way. And you can verify whether or not the U.S. government is actually asking that question. They give you the opportunity to verify that so you're not being scammed. Those defective and dependent and delinquent children, blind, and so on were asked about in 1880. And you'll see that by then, most places began to have different kinds of facilities, state facilities, asylums for these people where they could go to get assistance all in one place. And the information gained from all of those studies, by the way, the convict studies, everything, highlighted the need to do studies and collect information across the United States always. And so you'll find a certain number of states immediately after a census being asked to take part in certain surveys. Montana was one of 4 states asked to take part in one of these immediately after the 1910 census. And we have some great information out of it on the Choteau County and its homesteaders and childbirth. And again, it's one of only 4 places in the United States that were studied, and they depended on that, came directly from this type of schedule. Censuses as a timeline component for you provide then that important context, the social statistics across the township and the county, which is invaluable. You want to get a map right away, and that's where the map guide to the U.S. Federal Censuses book by Bill Dollarhide can come in and be helpful to you. Montana has 8 different pages in that book because we changed our county names, going from the 6 large counties and breaking them up as time went past right through 1923. You'll get direct clues regarding migration and migration patterns as a result of looking at these. So I'm saying to you, so which censuses should you get? Because this is a favorite question when I work with people. They'll say, well, it sounds like, there's a lot of them. Which one or which ones should I get and record? I'm going to tell you right now, if you're serious about your family history, you need to get all of them. If you find out later that there's a remnant of some type that you've got, or something that a special kind of schedule like a religious census, and you get a question, in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s at the local level, done privately by churches, you want to get that survey and that question information about your family, because again, the context for belonging to a church has changed mightily in the last 40 years. To end this, my golden rule of genealogy is, where there are laws like the decennial census mandate, which is out there be records and you want them. Anytime you see a law, the first thing I think of anyway is, oh goody, there's going to be some kind of record kept. What can we get into it? Is it accessible to us? And remember, most all of these things are very, very accessible, and they do become public information. For censuses, unfortunately, we don't get that information till 72 years later, but boy, going backwards, it can help you a great deal with your family. So make out your shopping list for the censuses you need and go after them in a very systematic fashion. I think you'll enjoy what you find. Make sure you write it in your timeline, because then you only have to take the timeline with you. You don't have to take all those other scraps of paper. So with that, I'm done.
Is there a census for people in institutions?
Yes. There's a the censuses beginning, for instance, in 1870, I found one of my relatives in a very infamous prison in New York, and all inmates were listed. Everything like that is done. You'll also find that military was asked to do their census in the same special way for active duty people. So just think of all of those things that we can think of. But yes, you will find them, Peggy.
Thank you.
I see Gary had a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. When I was involved with the census in 2020, I was asked to go to several Hutterite colonies. Am I saying that word right, Hutterite?
Yep.
However, every instance, I was diverted, and they used another method for that. It's the same with institutions of all kinds, whether they're prisons or if they're colleges. I was allowed to go on the Air Force base and do what I was asked to do. Sometimes we weren't asked to talk to people directly at the time because of the pandemic.
Yeah. So that was a special circumstance. And if they could collect that information in another way, they probably did. But Gary is referring to something, what happens when you've got a pandemic like we had in 1919, 1920, or in 2020, as we did? What happens with that census? Because they have to begin to do sampling. And so we might not get all that information for that particular census. Additionally, our latest censuses ask very few questions. Very, very few questions of people. But that again, I have to comfort myself and say, but we have people out there every day asking questions via telephone. Sometimes people get surveys in the mail, like the American Citizen census or whatever. So it can be a pretty interesting thing. Randy, did you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, when you send the notes out, could you include that example timeline?
Oh, sure. I will send it today, as a matter of fact, and send it back out, Randy. Randy, what's your email? And I'll send it directly to you.
It's BIGSKY 42, the number's 42.
Okay.
At live.com.
Okay. Live.com. I can do that. For many other people, I'm recognizing your things, and I know that you're going to get it because of it, but Randy, maybe not. Helen, are you on a list for the state, or are you on our list? Whoops, you're muted.
I get my information from Lewis and Clark County.
Okay, yeah,
College.
so it'll be out there right away.
Okay.
Gary,
One last question for me. Do you think it has become irrelevant to do a census with the thousands of data points we now have on each and every individual in existence on databases in the internet?
no, I think it's absolutely essential that we have it because this is a U.S. federal census and it takes certain kinds of questions to give input to Congress. Congress, I don't believe, or any of us should be depending on just some kind of data when we don't know where that data comes from, Gary. And even if there are data points, they have not been checked. I am for regulations. There's a very important reason why we have this U.S. Census. It was hard to understand, hard for me to understand in 2020 that we were not going to get every single person. I mean, I've run into censuses before where I know a census taker didn't go down a road in Swan Valley or something like that in 1950. And so you can see that later on. But I wonder what it will show 72 years from now when we're attempting to figure out who was there. Remember, that census is done so that money can be allotted appropriately to states and to territories for their needs. So every single time you exclude people or we don't have a way to count it that the U.S. Census is taking, we risk underscoring a whole thing of saying, we didn't get enough money. We didn't have this. We didn't have stuff for homeless. When they asked information about homeless children late in the 19th century, that was a very interesting question. It just disappeared from the census from that point on. And yet today, what do we have? We have a careful count being done by school districts. And Gary, I would trust that one because guess where that school district data goes? It goes to the state, and there is a mechanism for that data to go to the U.S. Census Bureau. So the only way I will trust data if I see that it has some means to go through some kind of a sieve that says this is trusted data. We have some great agencies that are they collect all kinds of wonderful information for us. Hopefully, when they collect that information and when it is looked at, because you will see it in the nerdish place out on C-SPAN where you can see people coming in and testifying to Congress. So you'll see their data. Hopefully what it does is it presses them to, meaning Congress, to begin to collect that data in some fashion that so that we know the federal signature on it. We know what it is.
Do you believe that the statistical sampling is a possible solution for some of the problems of counting every single person? Is it more accurate than an estimate under other means? And
it can be.
State,
yeah.
We had an undercount on all the Native American reservations.
Yes,
we had undercounts because of skewed data from fudging the data in the final round. This and that happened, but they had a way of fixing it.
They do have a way of fixing it because they are still collecting data in Indian censuses. So they can begin to collect that information. It's just whether it gets to the place that it needs to be in a timely fashion, Gary. But as we look at that, we have to be careful. Notice that in the information I gave you today, when they began sampling data in 1940 and in 1950, and you'll see it again in the 1960 census, I've been looking ahead. When they did that sampling, frequently it was because of data that they had prior, and they had some pretty good data on that particular piece of information. Like they asked in 1940, they asked women, how many kids have you ever had, excluding those that were stillborn? Okay, I can tell you that in Montana, and I'm going to assume some other states, I could be wrong, But in Montana by 1940, did you know that we had a special death certificate that said at the top, stillborn? It was actually, you can see it when you look at it, you can see that it's a yellow color. It's done separately. And when you go out and you look within Ancestry, for example, and you're looking just through the book, because you can do that. You can pick out one name and then just go through the book for an area. You will not find those stillborns there because they're classified again differently. Well, they had a lot of information on stillborns from different kinds of mortality records from the states beginning about 1880, 1890. And it really comes to the fore in 1900 and 1910. So it was interesting to me that they asked that question again. But they did it when they already had some pretty solid information from states. In other words, they had access to those state certificates. Jan, question?
You know what? I just keep going back to my uncle, who I still don't know where he is when he came back from being in Hawaii as a prisoner and then ended up somewhere in California. I'm just to the point where I'm saying, well, why can't I find him from 1945 to through about 1950?
So you're going to want to, Jan, that person, remember, he was a prisoner. So what do we want to do? We want to go back to Hawaii and say, would you please give me his intake sheet so I know what he is using as an AKA, as an alias.
Okay.
And then the other thing to do is in California, ask them again if they have special reports on AKAs. I know that Gail got one that was an AKA, an alias. She was able to get it. It showed both names on the death record. So take a look.
It's another avenue to run down. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Dan.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Is there any process or mechanism for correcting the transcription errors in censuses?
You can do it, Ancestry allows you to correct it. And you can put the note out there at Ancestry. I haven't seen it at the U.S. Census Bureau yet, but I know that they're still working with their AI, their artificial intelligence. But I know it's planned to be able to correct it because that is tough, isn't it? Although the best AI, the best artificial intelligence I've seen yet for the 1950 census is directly right out at the U.S. Census Bureau stuff. It's way better than others. And that's ironic because, Ancestry and MyHeritage were working with them. And it's, I believe, some of the original technology from Ancestry that they began to use. But it's very clear. It's very nice. Remember, when you can't find a person, say that you're looking in that 1950 census and you're saying, I can't find that person, immediately go over to one of the other sites. We have MyHeritage, we have Ancestry, we have several things. We have the U.S. Census, and look there because it might just be clearer there. Every time we get people involved with actually putting in the names, they're going to do their best job. We know they're going to put in their best hint, but it may not be helpful to us at all. We just have to be open to a lot of spellings, and maybe we have to be open to just going right down through that whole census. I've got the Ferndale Community Census is only about 12 pages on the Lake County side, and it's about not quite that many pages on the Flathead side. So maybe I had 25 pages total to go through. One side did their job really well. They printed. It is the most gorgeous thing you have ever seen. The other dude used Palmer method. I can recognize it as a former teacher. And the writing is good, but there's kind of some funky capital letters. And I did find one that I said, I'd correct this if I could, out at the US, because it was the guy's last name. It begins with an I, but it's definitely a J in Palmer. That's what it looks like
Yeah.
in there. So you have to be willing to look at a lot of lines. I can tell you, Linda Long looked forever to find her family in Chicago, but she was dedicated enough to do that. And what she discovered was the old thing that you have to also look for. The census taker got excited and switched the first and the last name.
Yeah.
They gone. So that's another census strategy you have to look for.
Well, and maybe a follow-up question. When you see a relative census after census say they're from Indiana, and then all of a sudden they say they're from Ohio, is that forgetfulness or how did they forget where they were from, or was it an error on the census taker writing it
Yeah.
down? He mixed up with some other family, or
You
I don't
have
know.
to
How does
remember,
that work?
through 1950, the census taker took the information down on some huge sheets. I mean, they're monster size sheets. They're 14 by 17 pages for
Wow.
each family. They took that down. Then they went and transcribed that. Hopefully it's not a transcription error. It could be. It could also be that at the time, I want you to check and see, was Indiana ever a part of Ohio territory, vice versa? What was it part of? Because again, remember, they're answering that question in those censuses according to the delineations given to them by the census staff. My grandma was born in Silesia. I only saw that once ever in the census. After that, she was Polish. And in 1940, she was German. Now, I'm sorry, that never switched. The only thing that switched were the directions to the census takers. That's all. So that could be at play. Or you could just plain have an error. And so you're going to want to dig a little deeper and say, okay, I've been accepting this as a birthplace. What happened here for this one census? Did someone else give the information who didn't know him very well?
Right.
What could have happened? By the way, Randy, I write those questions right into my timelines. I want them there.
Okay.
And then I want to line them out right in there when I know that I have answered that question. I'll put it down, put the date right there and say, I answered this question, and it's whatever, because I just find it saves me time. My Cogleiser timeline, the total one, is about 40 some pages, and it
Wow.
involves many of our families. But whenever I go to research that family, I never have to take more than my timeline. Everything is there. It's there. And my questions are there. And I can scribble. I will deliberately make sure that if I'm putting it into a notebook, I make sure that only the right side has the typed information and the left side is clear, so I can write any information I want to, more questions or whatever, so that I have information that is current to the research I'm doing right now. Timelines, you got to love them. Anyone else? Well, thank you guys for not going to sleep.
Oh, no,
Thank you.
never.
And
Never.
and thanks for the good time. This is another way to look at censuses. A lot of that, the information, of course, I've aggregated a lot of this through the years, and believe me, there's hundreds more questions. These are not the only questions that were asked, but they're things that I've kind of found. I'll have people say, well, I really only want to know this particular thing, at least till you've got that piece of information, and then you really only want to know the next piece. If you know that these are categorized, that they're classified in certain ways, then you can go after them pretty neatly. So I'm still going to tell you that census book, Facts, Schedules, and Workbooks for the U.S. Federal Census. I'm going to tell you that's one of the finest gifts you can give yourself. I mean, don't we all give ourselves a Christmas gift? I began doing that when my kid was a year old and too young to give me a gift, and I felt sorry for the fact that I only had a gift or two under the tree. And I said, well, but I have a right to give myself anything. So each and every year at Christmas, I make sure there's a gift that I have wrapped very carefully, and it is under the tree, and it is something that I dearly wanted. Because I dearly wanted it, I'm the one who should get it because I best know how to fulfill that. So I hope you have happy holidays. In 2 weeks.